Part 1. Abraham Lincoln and the End of Slavery. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a story that's supposed to be inspiring, profound, and yes, a little bit exhausting if you let your brain wander. So dim the lights, grab a blanket, maybe a lukewarm cup of tea, and let's float gently into the world of 19th century American politics. Abraham Lincoln, Honest Abe. The tall guy in a stovepipe hat who somehow managed to look perpetually worried in almost every portrait ever painted of him. Now, when we talk about Lincoln, most people immediately jump to the Emancipation Proclamation, the Gettysburg Address, and the general sense of, wow, this guy changed history. And yes, he did, but not without a good deal of tension, irony, and downright awkward political maneuvering, because history, unlike those neat textbooks, rarely fits into a tidy three-point bullet list. First, let's set the scene. It's the mid-1800s. America is a country divided not just by geography, but economy, culture, and, crucially, the institution of slavery. In the North, industrialization hums along, factories churn, and abolitionist movements gain steam. In the South, plantations dominate, cotton is king, and slavery is, tragically, the backbone of the economy. And smack in the middle of all this is Abraham Lincoln, a man of humble beginnings, self-taught in law with a knack for words that could cut through political nonsense like a warm knife through butter. Or at least that's how the legend goes. But Lincoln wasn't a saintly superhero who waltzed onto the political stage and waved a magic wand over the United States. Of course he wasn't. He had doubts, political compromises, and moments where he probably stared into the ceiling thinking, how did I get here? For example, he initially wasn't calling for outright abolition in every state. He was careful, cautious, strategic, partly because if he pushed too hard, he risked losing the border states to the Confederacy, and, well, the entire Union could unravel. Speaking of the Confederacy, let's drift over to those southern states. Once Lincoln was elected in 1860, they decided rather dramatically that they didn't want to be part of the United States anymore, and thus began the Civil War. Now, the war itself is a massive topic, but for tonight, we're going to float lightly over it like a slow-moving fog. What matters here is how Lincoln navigated the politics and human suffering that came with ending slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued in 1863, didn't immediately free every enslaved person in the United States. That's a detail often glossed over in school books and inspirational quotes. It applied only to the Confederate states that were in rebellion, not the border states or areas already under Union control. It was, in essence, a carefully calculated political and military move. And here's the gentle irony. It made the war about human freedom, but it also meant that Lincoln was still very much working within a system that required compromise. And then there's Lincoln's personal life, which was, as you might imagine, not all poetry and candlelight. Mary Todd Lincoln, his wife, was sharp, ambitious, and prone to intense emotional swings. Their household was filled with both intellectual energy and domestic tension. The Lincolns endured the heartbreaking loss of children, dealt with mental health struggles, and navigated the relentless pressures of a country at war. Honest Abe himself was known to be melancholic, reflective, and occasionally darkly humorous in private. He had a dry wit that probably helped him survive the constant stress of leadership. Lincoln's speeches, particularly the Gettysburg Address, weren't just eloquence for its own sake. They were carefully crafted instruments of persuasion, reminding a fractured nation why the struggle was worth it, and gently nudging public opinion toward the moral imperative of ending slavery. In a sense, Lincoln had to wear multiple hats: visionary, tactician, negotiator, and moral conscience. all while remaining tall, gaunt, and looking like you might drift off into a thoughtful nap at any moment. And let's not forget the political theater. Lincoln had rivals, critics, and even friends who questioned every decision. Cabinet meetings were arenas of debate, compromise, and occasionally quiet snark. Lincoln, as history records, could be patient and kind, but he could also deliver a line of quiet sarcasm that left others flustered. There's a certain beauty in imagining these high-stakes political battles unfolding in rooms filled with cigar smoke, flickering candlelight, and the ever-present shadow of human suffering outside the windows. So, as we settle into this gentle drift through history, consider the human side of Lincoln's story. A man tasked with ending one of the gravest injustices in American history, navigating a war that would claim hundreds of thousands of lives, and doing it all with a combination of careful strategy, moral reflection, and a wry sense of humor that few appreciated in his time. He didn't end slavery with a single proclamation or speech. It was a complex, gradual process requiring legislative victories, military campaigns, and the unwavering persistence of countless individuals. And there's an almost poetic tragedy to it. Lincoln, this towering figure of morality and intellect, didn't live to see the full fruits of his labor. He was assassinated in 1865, just days after the Confederate surrender. The nation he helped preserve and transform would continue to struggle with the legacies of slavery for generations. But for tonight, we simply float here, appreciating the layers of history, the personal, the political, the tragic, and the ironic. Honest Abe, the towering man in the stovepipe hat, navigating a fractured nation, working toward a freedom that was both immediate and distant, and somehow managing to leave behind words and actions that would echo far beyond his own troubled lifetime. Part 2. Lincoln's Political Struggles and the Road to Emancipation. And then there's Mary Todd Lincoln, his wife, who has often been misunderstood. Sharp, ambitious, emotionally volatile, and deeply invested in her husband's legacy, she brought both energy and tension to the White House. Their interactions were a mix of intellectual partnership, occasional argument, and deep familial love, tinged with the grief of losing two young sons. One can almost picture them in quiet evening moments, exchanging ideas or frustrations, the candlelight flickering across the tall, narrow windows of their residence. Lincoln's melancholy is a subject that fascinates historians. Letters, diaries, and anecdotes reveal a man who experienced profound sadness, perhaps bordering on depression by modern standards. Yet he also possessed a dry, wry sense of humor that surfaced in quiet, private moments. Some contemporaries described him as capable of making people laugh without ever raising his voice, a subtle, almost ghostly humor perfectly suited for a man who carried the burden of a nation on his shoulders. Meanwhile, the Civil War itself raged on. Battles were fought across vast landscapes, lives lost in staggering numbers, and families torn apart. Lincoln, ever the meticulous leader, often reviewed battle plans personally. He edited orders, suggested maneuvers, and corresponded with generals, balancing strategic insight with moral considerations. He knew that every command he gave, every decision he influenced, could result in life or death for thousands. It's a haunting responsibility, yet he handled it with what seems to us now like calm persistence, even if it meant sleepless nights and long walks through the corridors of the White House. Let's also consider the soldiers, the human cogs in this immense historical machine. Young men, barely out of boyhood, facing unimaginable circumstances. Frostbite, disease, starvation, and constant danger were their daily companions. Lincoln understood this. He issued careful policies, urged compassion when possible, and celebrated bravery without romanticizing the horrors of war. It's an almost hypnotic image, a tall, thin president endlessly corresponding with generals, trying to humanize the war while still pressing forward toward an ultimate goal. And the political landscape remained treacherous. Radical factions pushed for immediate and total abolition. Moderates urged caution, and opponents criticized every decision. Lincoln navigated this minefield with patience and subtle wit. Cabinet meetings could be tense, arguments heated, but Lincoln often diffused situations with quiet observation or a wry remark. One can imagine the irony he must have felt managing life and death while occasionally cracking a joke only he understood. Now, back to the Emancipation Proclamation. Its strategic brilliance cannot be overstated. By declaring freedom for slaves in rebellious states, Lincoln redefined the purpose of the war and prevented European powers from supporting the Confederacy. Yet the proclamation was not a magic wand. Many enslaved people remained in bondage, particularly in Union-held territories. Full abolition required legislative action, eventually achieved through the 13th Amendment. The process was slow, complex, and deeply human, a combination of political acumen, moral urgency, and relentless perseverance. So, tonight, as you drift further into this history, consider the duality of Lincoln's experience. The public figure, a towering symbol of justice, strategy, and leadership. The private man, a husband, father, melancholy thinker, and subtly humorous observer of human folly. Both dimensions are crucial to understanding why he could guide a nation through its darkest hours and leave a legacy that endures. Even as we float gently through these reflections, it's worth remembering that Lincoln's achievements were intertwined with countless others: generals, lawmakers, ordinary citizens, and of course, the enslaved people whose resilience and courage helped reshape the nation. History, after all, is never a solo performance. It's a symphony of human experience. And Lincoln, for all his height and intellect, was one of many voices orchestrating a delicate, transformative score. Part 4. The Legacy of Lincoln and the Ongoing Struggle. As we drift gently into the next layer of this story, let's explore the legacy of Abraham Lincoln and the broader consequences of his actions. Because ending slavery, as monumental as it was, did not suddenly resolve every injustice. History, like a slow river, keeps moving long after the individual has left the shore. Lincoln's assassination in April 1865 casts a long, melancholy shadow over his achievements. Just days after the Confederate surrender, the nation lost the man who had carried it through its most perilous hours. One can imagine him, exhausted, contemplative, finally allowing himself a rare moment of relief, only for fate to intervene. It's a tragic punctuation mark in a story filled with irony, human frailty, and profound achievement. And yet, his death elevated him almost immediately into the realm of myth. Portraits, statues, speeches, and stories proliferated, cementing Lincoln as the archetype of wisdom, perseverance, and moral courage. But beneath the myth lies the very human reality of political compromise, personal struggle, and relentless responsibility. Even in his final moments, Lincoln was a man shaped by circumstance, striving to do right in a world fraught with complexity. The legacy of emancipation was similarly layered. The 13th Amendment legally abolished slavery, but systemic racism, economic disparity, and social injustice persisted. The work of Lincoln and others laid crucial foundations, but generations of activists, lawmakers, and ordinary citizens would continue to build upon them. In a sense, Lincoln's story reminds us that monumental change is rarely immediate. It is cumulative, slow, and often painfully incremental. Let's float over to the personal anecdotes that give Lincoln's legacy a quieter human texture. He corresponded with citizens, offered comfort to grieving families, and sometimes engaged in small private acts of kindness. There are stories of Lincoln visiting hospitals, talking with soldiers, and even offering humorous comments to ease tension. These small gestures, often lost in grand historical narratives, reveal the empathetic core of a man who bore enormous public burdens. And then there's the image that has endured. The stovepipe hat, the tall frame, the deep-set eyes, and the melancholy expression. These visuals are almost like symbols themselves, shorthand for integrity, wisdom, and the enduring struggle for justice. Artists and photographers captured him in ways that emphasized height and gravity, almost as if his physical stature were meant to mirror the moral weight he carried. Political maneuvering continued even after his death. The Reconstruction era, fraught with controversy, conflict, and slow social change, demonstrated that ending slavery was not the final step in America's moral journey. Lincoln's careful strategies, while pivotal, had set the stage for others to continue the work, sometimes succeeding, sometimes faltering, but always moving forward. It's a reminder that leadership is rarely a solo act, and that the fruits of vision often require patient tending by many hands. And as we glide toward the quieter reflections of history, consider the lessons embedded in Lincoln's life. Leadership is not only about decisiveness, but also about empathy, patience, and the capacity to endure personal melancholy while guiding a nation. Freedom, justice, and moral progress are rarely instantaneous. They are cumulative, fragile, and sometimes painfully slow. Tonight, as you rest and allow these stories to settle in your mind, think of Lincoln not just as a hero, but as a man navigating a world of immense complexity, human folly, and tragic circumstance. His life, his work, and his legacy continue to ripple outward, reminding us that history is both vast and intimate, monumental and personal. And with that, we gently prepare to move toward the final reflections of this long journey through Lincoln's life and the end of slavery, appreciating the intertwining of human struggle, political strategy, and moral courage. Part 5. Reflections on Freedom, Morality, and Legacy. As we drift into the final stretch of this historical meditation, let's settle into the quiet reflections that Lincoln's life and work invite. By now, we've wandered through his political maneuvers, the human cost of the Civil War, his personal melancholy, and the incremental progress toward emancipation. And yet the story is far from simple. History rarely is. Lincoln's legacy is both monumental and quietly human. He reminds us that moral courage often requires patience, calculation, and at times a willingness to tolerate imperfection. Ending slavery was not a single act, not a decisive proclamation, not even a single amendment. It was a layered process, a slow unraveling of entrenched injustice, guided by careful policy, human empathy, and relentless advocacy. And let's float over to the broader consequences. The Civil War, though primarily aimed at preserving the Union, became the crucible in which freedom was forged. Hundreds of thousands of lives were lost, countless families shattered, and yet the nation emerged, slowly, toward a more just society. The Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, and the countless individual acts of courage by ordinary people all form threads in the tapestry Lincoln helped shape. The human side of this story remains striking. Lincoln endured personal grief, household tension, and constant pressure from the public and politicians alike. He knew the limits of his own power, yet he persisted, relying on intellect, empathy, and a wry, subtle sense of humor to navigate the impossible. Imagine those long evenings in the White House, reviewing letters, pondering strategy, perhaps allowing himself a small private laugh at some ironic twist of politics or human folly.
And then there is the enduring symbolism. The tall figure in the stovepipe hat, the melancholy eyes, the careful hands shaping letters and decrees. They are reminders of how individual character and circumstance can intersect with history to produce meaningful change. Lincoln did not achieve perfection, nor did he erase injustice entirely, but he moved a nation incrementally toward justice, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire reflection, study, and contemplation. Tonight, as you allow these stories to settle like soft shadows in your mind, remember that history is rarely neat. It is a mixture of triumph and struggle, of brilliance and error, of moral clarity and human weakness. Abraham Lincoln exemplifies this duality. His life teaches us that progress is rarely instantaneous, that leadership is a delicate balance of empathy, intellect, and moral courage, and that even in the darkest moments, careful, persistent action can shape the course of history. And so, we end this long, calm journey through Lincoln's life and the end of slavery. Relax, breathe, and appreciate the subtle, enduring human story beneath the monuments, speeches, and historical myths. Honest Abe, melancholy, thoughtful, and profoundly human, continues to teach us about the power of patience, principle, and perseverance. Thank you for floating gently through this history tonight. May your thoughts drift as softly as the stories themselves, and may you carry a quiet reflection on freedom, morality, and the remarkable complexity of human endeavor
into your own life. Conclusion: a gentle reflection. So, as we close this long and quiet journey through the life of Abraham Lincoln and the end of slavery, let's pause for a final reflection. History, as we've seen, is never neat or simple. It unfolds slowly, with compromises, with setbacks, and with small steps forward. Lincoln's story reminds us of that truth. He was not perfect, and he was not free from flaws. He carried sadness, uncertainty, and the weight of impossible decisions. Yet, within that heaviness, he managed to steer a fractured nation through its darkest years. His words, his patience, and his steady persistence nudged America toward a new chapter, one where slavery no longer held legal ground. The world did not transform overnight. The struggles continued, and injustice did not simply vanish, but the foundation Lincoln helped to lay, brick by brick, still stands today as a reminder of what moral courage and determined leadership can achieve. And so, as you drift off tonight, think of Lincoln not as a statue or a myth, but as a human being, a husband, a father, a leader, and, at times, a melancholy dreamer who believed the nation could be better than it was. His story lingers because it is deeply human, imperfect, fragile, but enduring. Now let the noise of history quiet down in your thoughts, and rest in the knowledge that even in the hardest times, progress, though slow, is always possible.